Welcome, everyone. We have the Infosys Science Foundation lecture today, and we have Dr. Amit Sharma, renowned structural biologist, with us. We're going to be talking about evolution since Darwin and the connect with the human microbiome. The next time you look into the mirror, think about this. There are many ways you're more microbe than human. There are 10 times more microorganisms like bacteria and fungi in and on our bodies than there are human cells. Scientists have a name for this, and it is called the human microbiome. By the way, most of these microorganisms are good for us. So where do these microorganisms come from? Have they been evolving for as long as us human beings? And talking about evolution, we all know about Darwin's theory of natural selection. But if all of us evolved from common ancestors, how does this theory of natural selection really work? To tell us more about this, we have Dr. Sharma with us. Dr. Sharma currently heads the Structural and Computational Biology Group at the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, New Delhi. He obtained his doctoral degree in '95 from Northwestern University, Evanston, USA, in the area of protein crystallography. Afterwards, he joined Oxford University as a junior research fellow in the area of structural biology. Dr. Sharma is a member of all 3 premier Indian science academies and has won many, many prestigious accolades, including most recently the Infosys Prize last year, the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award in Biological Sciences in 2011, and B.M. Birla Science Prize in 2006. Dr. Sharma's team recently collaborated with researchers from Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard to conduct a breakthrough study about the treatment of malaria. He's a photography enthusiast and loves to strum his guitar as well. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Sharma on stage and tell us more about his fascination for Darwin and his theory of evolution. Dr. Sharma.
Good afternoon. If somebody had told me a few years ago that I'd be standing up here and talking to this august Infosys audience, I wouldn't have believed them. Because I've been, and so many of us have been so enamored and intrigued and also enthralled by Infosys as a IT structure, as the citadel of IT revolution in the world. So thank you very much for this invitation. But times are changing. I'm going to try to cover 150 years of revolutions in molecular biology, but very cursorily, because the whole idea is not to only talk about science, but to also talk about bad science, and specifically to talk about science which is either deliberately or due to human incompetence misunderstood, and what happens when science is misunderstood either deliberately or otherwise. And you would see, and I hope by the end of the talk you would agree, that it's very, very crucial to put science in the right social context, because it can be extremely dangerous if it's misunderstood or misapplied and misdirected against humankind. So very briefly, I don't need to update this audience. You know the Earth has existed for 4.5 billion years. And just to put that in context, this small blip here on the left-hand side of the screen represents continuous reincarnation of a 100-year-old human being 50,000 times. So time is a very, very vast idea that cannot be understood by the human mind easily, especially 4.5 billion years. If you look at it in terms of human evolution, since if you were to condense this 4.5 billion years into 24 hours, then the whole of human evolution, the whole of humanity that's existed for, let's say, 100 to 150,000 years, is in the blink of an eye. So go ahead and blink your eye, and that's the end of humanity. For the rest of this talk, you're in time, which is extra time, which belongs to evolution and to the forces of evolution. And we're going to try to understand some of them but also try to deviate from that topic. In fact, this lecture has never been given before, because it's going to deviate from that topic of how misunderstanding of Darwinian principles was used against humanity over the course of a whole century, and possibly still is being used. So Charles Darwin came across a lot of literature before he was convinced that it was natural selection that drives human evolution and evolution of our life. And so one of his gurus was Charles Lyell, who was a geologist. And Charles Lyell had published a book about the very slow, gradual evolution of Earth, that Earth didn't just appear as the monotheistic religions used to propagate at the time and still do, that Earth is 5,000 to 6,000 years old. We know that's not true. There's no evidence for that. We know that it's close to 4.5 billion years. And so Earth itself as an entity evolved very slowly over a very long period of time. And this was Charles Lyell's ideas, and that's the common misunderstanding that people have, that if one is not able to understand simple phenomena like daily weather, how is it that we are able to predict the evolution of Earth? But in fact, there's huge amounts of data to support that Earth has evolved over 4.5 billion years. But there were several misunderstandings along the way, not only the time it took for Earth to evolve, but also the fact that because of, again, creationist ideas and monotheistic religious ideas, Earth was considered to be at the center of the universe. And this was not true. As you know, Copernicus and later Galileo proved that this is not the case. They went against the ethos of the time, much like Charles Darwin would do later on, and saying that Earth is not the center of the universe. In fact, Earth rotates around the sun, and even the sun is not at the center of the universe. And in fact, we don't know still what is at the center of the universe. And so for this, Galileo was castigated, as you know, jailed. But he stuck with his ideas, and we now consider Galileo as the father of modern science, because he overthrew a very prevalent idea of the time, which was that Earth is at the center of the universe, basically driven by creationist ideas. So we skip from Galileo to Darwin, because Darwin's evolution, for me, was an even bigger revolution. A common man wouldn't probably at the time, or perhaps even today, care too much whether we go around the sun or the sun goes around other stars, or whatever the constellation of planetary movements are. On a daily life, humans are not necessarily interested in that, except unless you're astrophysicists and so on. But Charles Darwin hit back at the very core of human existence by challenging the whole idea of creationist theories that God had created mankind, and came up with this idea of origin, which is extrapolated and expanded upon in The Origin of Species' book, that the process of natural selection drives evolution of life on Earth. We're not going to discuss in detail the tenets of this. Very simply speaking, there are enough standing variations, which we know now are genetic variations, and if a stressful event happens, there's a biological or environmental stress, the species or individuals that survive are the ones that are able to withstand that stress. In other words, are able to adapt to that stress very well. And so those are the survivors. And that term, misfortunate term called survival of the fittest, which wasn't coined by Darwin, got stuck to Darwin's ideas. But essentially it amounts to that those who are not necessarily the fittest, but the ones who adapt the best to a new challenge will survive under stressful conditions. And so these are the core of the Darwinian ideas. And as you can imagine, it was extremely threatening and challenging for the population then, and possibly is for more than half the world today, to accept the idea that so-called God hasn't created mankind, that in fact all life on Earth has evolved by very slow, gradual processes, which we are going to go through. And Darwin was castigated a little bit at the time, but significantly more later on, and in fact today is as well, especially for example in states, in the United States and other countries where so-called intelligent design is being floated as the alternative theory, which again, for which there is no evidence. So let's look at it. Darwin's ideas have been considered in sarcasm. So here's Darwin taking his book to a publisher, and he's saying, not very good, Mr. Darwin, but perhaps your writing will improve gradually over time. So this is essentially alluding to the idea that Darwin said that life evolves gradually over time. And Darwin has been repeatedly been the butt of jokes like this to challenge his ideas about how life might have evolved. Here's another one. One of the tenets amongst many in Darwinian ideas is that the mutations that underlie such evolution are random, they are not directed, they are unplanned and unforeseen. So they don't know the stress that they are going to face, and these standing mutations are just there in the society. And so here's another joke on that. Mind you, it's just a theory I have, but I'm willing to climb down if you are. These are basically our antecedents, primates, which are still in the trees, have not really decided to come down to Earth. But we know that from Darwinian ideas that the evolution necessarily has been extremely slow, and is so slow that it's imperceptible in the case of human beings. And it's also very stepwise. And so here's another joke which says, those monkeys, this is in heavens, those monkeys are taking forever to evolve, we need a backup plan. Well, if your perspective on time is strictly according to your own perception of time, then I think it's almost impossible to imagine the time it requires to evolve and continue to evolve human beings or even other primates or even smaller animals, just because the length of time and the selection process are unpredictable and therefore very difficult to perceive. Nonetheless, because of all these ideas, a myth that coexisted at the time and still exists is that human beings are the most evolved species on Earth, that we are near perfect products of life's evolution, that we are masters of the universe, and therefore we master over all land, all its creatures, which are at our disposal for utilization. This is also embedded in monotheistic religions, which is the reason why the idea of conquest over territories is so strongly built in these monotheistic religions to a certain extent, which is to go and take over tribal lands and show them this is the way things have to be done. And so this idea is of course now seriously challenged. As you know, all human beings, least of all perhaps the perfectly evolved life on Earth. So what are human beings? In fact, we are flawed, we are unresolved, we are delusional. Anybody who's not living in denial would know that we suffer from all sorts of problems. Some of them are listed here. And again, in a cartoon format, it says here, eating the forbidden fruits will cause death. These are side effects include depression, anxiety, anger, sorrow, conflict, hate, and so on, loss of appetite for the word of God. Even that is a disease in itself. So you can see that human beings have been and are an extremely complicated biological system to try to explain with creationist theories. And I would like to propose that the only way that we can really begin to understand human beings is in the context of modern molecular biology, which we will come to towards the end of the talk. But one of the Darwin's achievements at the time and later has been instilling doubt in people's minds. Don't take the word that's written in any book, including his own book, unless there is specific evidence to back that up. And that's again put in a cartoon format. Here it says, today is National Atheist Day, and the lady next to her says, I just don't believe that. So the level of doubt has to be so high that you don't buy anybody's ideas unless they are testable and there is experimental evidence or theoretical evidence to back that up. If you don't have these checks in place, you will see what happens with the examples that I'm going to show you. One can fall into the trap of pseudoscience and how dangerous that can be. So disbelief has to be acknowledged, it has to be supported, it has to be encouraged in our children. Here's another one, I don't believe it. The gates of heaven are closed because heaven is saying that no atheists are allowed in here. Just because the entry of an atheist would then promote this idea that disbelief is the only way to progress in the state when there is a lack of evidence and you need evidence to back up whatever scientific theories you may be propagating. So given this background, let's talk about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was not the discoverer of human evolution by natural selection. There was a co-discoverer called Alfred Wallace, who was also an Englishman, and they were friends, in fact, and indeed Wallace perhaps arrived at this idea of natural selection before Charles Darwin. He communicated his works to Charles Darwin, and they decided in gentlemanly fashion, which is not going to happen these days, to produced the results together at the Academy in London, which happened on the 1st of July in 1858, as is shown here. And it says here, audience was not enthusiastic about either study. And in fact, the next day, when the proceedings of this meeting were published by the president, he said, and I quote, "The year had not yielded any particularly noteworthy discoveries." We're talking about a year after the discovery of natural selection as the driving force for evolution, and yet the whole scientific community in UK, which was full of learned people, thought they were not noteworthy discoveries. That's how wrong even an scientific audience can get in terms of understanding the discoveries that are just facing it in the face. We have to be thankful to Charles Darwin, of course, but I think if you start to talk about modern molecular biology, the laws of inheritance of what we know now are genes, were essentially set up by Gregory Mendel. And the two people, Charles Darwin and Gregory Mendel, who, as you can see from the years that they existed, more or less overlapped, actually never met. And unfortunately, one of Mendel's famous works was part of Charles Darwin's library, and he never got to read it because he was very busy with his own work. Had he read it, I think he would have given a better explanation for, at the time, what was considered laws of inheritance, how traits can be transmitted from one generation to the other. Nonetheless, Darwin was mostly right. Mendel was always right. Mendel, as you know or may not know, Mendel was a clergyman. He got bored being a clergy, but continued to stay in the monastery because, it was a nice place to stay, was being looked after, and the head clergyman would let him play around with peas, which is where he did all his experiments for laws of inheritance. It's not the first time, by the way, that somebody who had been reading theology, which is Gregory Mendel, moved to biology, which is B. So the movement from T to B is something that has happened not only in the case of Gregory Mendel, it happened in the case of many other scientists, including Charles Darwin, who was also attracted to being a clergy initially. And that's a good movement. People are moving from T to B, leaving alone theology, which is a study of religion, to biology, as in the land of science and land of reason. That's a good thing. But there are many variations on this theme. One has to be very careful. These variations didn't exist only at that time. In fact, today, some of these variations exist in India and outside as well. So you can go from T to B, as is shown here in the second one, convert and discover some principles, like Alfred Wallace did. He also discovered theory of evolution by natural selection. But then he started to move back towards theology. He said, this is also beautiful. God must have made it. So that was the end of biology for him. You could have worse scenarios. You could actually go from B to T, as in you're a successful biologist, all your papers are getting rejected, and you just give up and become a clergyman. Happens once in a while, and some people I know have been very keen on doing this. You could have even worse scenarios. You could have T plus B, as in you have discovered, for example, that taking Asthalin inhaler in the morning gets rid of your asthmatic attack, and you attribute it not only to the Asthalin or to the salbutamol, that's the active ingredient of that inhaler, but you attribute it also to God. So I took the inhaler, but in addition, God helped me get over my asthma attack. That's T plus B. Not a great situation to be, but the worst situation of all is T multiplied by B. You have theological basis for explaining biology. You may have an idea that God is against all gay people in the world, therefore gay people should be killed. God is against dark-skinned people or African people or infirm people or people who have mental disorders, and therefore they should be killed. That's a T times B multiplication, for which I will show you examples. For those examples to be shown, I have to introduce a new character into this story. And he's really, in a way, the central character in today's talk. His name is Francis Galton, who's shown here in a smaller form, along with Charles Darwin and Gregory Mendel, because he overlapped his lifespan with these two. So who was Francis Galton? I don't know how many people are aware of him in the audience. By all measures here, he would seem something extraordinary. He was a child prodigy. He read at the age of 2. He was fluent in Greek and Latin by the age of 5, as it says. Apparently was able to solve quadratic equations by the age of 8. He attended Cambridge University in UK, which was at the time and remains the premier institution in UK. And he traveled extensively in Africa and Middle East, which is what rich people did in UK for lack of anything else to do. And so, as you know, Darwin was also taking journeys at the same time. Darwin was traveling in Galapagos Island to collect fossils and look at birds to collect evidence for his theory of evolution, and Francis Galton also traveled. However, when Francis Galton traveled, and in this case in 1844 from England to Egypt and Sudan, he came back with a very dire impression of the people he met there. He said, "I saw enough of savage races to give me material to think about for the rest of my life." So instead of the perception that Darwin had when he saw different races, different animals in different states of being, Francis Galton traveled and saw something completely different. And this is going to be a key point for the rest of the lecture. He came back and he was fairly disgusted with what he saw, according to him. And he came up with this word called eugenics. He is the one who coined this word, eugenics. Eugenics stands for good birth, U as in good and genes for birth. And his idea was that the only way to improve humankind is by controlling reproduction of humankind. These ideas basically swept through 19th century and 20th century till the middle of 20th century, and possibly they exist even now in various forms, even in India. Eugenics, the whole idea was to save society from so-called inferior minds. Now you would immediately realize that this argument wouldn't hold water because there was no way to identify inferior minds, so-called inferior minds, unless it was simply on the basis of the skin of their color. But Francis had other ideas. So let's look at who actually Francis Galton was. Actually, this is a very interesting part of the story because Francis Galton was the first cousin of Charles Darwin. They share the same grandfather, the illustrious Erasmus Darwin. So they come from the same lineage. And Francis Galton, despite the fact that he was extraordinarily bright, suffered all his life from a serious complex that he was not the first one to have thought of the origin of species by natural selection, which Darwin had come up with. And he forever, therefore, lived in his shadow, in his intellectual shadow. And he could not bear this. He writes here, "The appearance of your origin of species," this is a letter he wrote to Darwin, "formed a real crisis in my life, etc. It drove away the constraint of my old superstition, and then it gave me freedom of thought." This freedom of thought was essentially an antithesis, in an extent, of Charles Darwin's ideas. So on the one hand, you see the most noble Charles Darwin traveling to collect samples. This is from the Voyage of the Beagle in 1839, and he writes, "If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." Which basically means we accept the fact that natural laws are very brutal and cruel to a lot of the humanity, but let's not add misery to them by creating institutions that discard such people. But, of course, this was not Francis Galton's idea. He essentially had the opposite idea, despite the fact that they were very close together and they were cousins. Galton's idea was positive eugenics. Let's not do charity, because charity upset the whole mechanism of natural selection. If you go and help poor people, you are actually allowing them to survive. Artificial selection, therefore, was the solution, which is you should effectively not allow such people to breed. He wanted eugenics to be the new religion of the future because he thought this is the only way to save humanity. And he wanted eugenics to be recognized as an authentic science. And here starts the idea of pseudoscience. He was himself consumed with jealousy for Charles Darwin's ideas. And he was also consumed by his lack of any deep insight that he had himself had into nature. He was also extremely arrogant. And he came up with this term called nature versus nurture, which, as you know, is a very famous term. It's very loosely used in the media all the time to explain all kinds of things which are usually wrong. His ideas were essentially that between the hereditary influences and environmental influences, the only one that matters is the hereditary influence. If your genes are right, you're right. If your genes are wrong, you're wrong. That was his black and white idea. For him, the idea of status, which is to say that you are an achieved person in the society, let us say that you are the CEO of Infosys, This was an outcome of privilege and opportunity. That's not okay for Galton. Somebody should not be CEO of Infosys just because he or she has worked hard for it. That must be embedded in that person's genes. So hereditary can explain that, and it must be exclusive and justified. In today's terms, which basically implies that great men will have great children, which, as you know, is not true. I don't need to talk about any personal or names, but you know, in political families in India, this is absolutely not true. So, nonetheless, it didn't stop Francis Galton from going ahead and propagating his views very, very strongly. And remember, bad science looks like good science. And for the layman, it's just science. And so it can propagate very fast through generations and populations, as indeed it did. This is the book he wrote, Hereditary Genius, the first book he wrote, in which he's essentially treating human beings like dogs and animals which are bred. In many cases, as you know, dogs and animals are bred to augment some particular function that is useful in those dogs. For example, the ability to bark or pick up different smells, or in horses to run faster. For him, it was no different in the case of humans. If dogs and horses could be bred for a superior purpose, for example, running fast, why couldn't humans be bred to have more and more intelligent human beings? He wrote this Hereditary Genius, which became very popular, I should say, and that was not enough to satisfy Galton, because Galton forever was an intellectual dwarf to Darwin, and he knew that. And so, for him, what mattered was the fact that Charles Darwin has to authenticate Francis Galton's ideas. And so he wrote to Darwin about his book and sent the book to him. And Darwin wrote back to him. We're not going to go through the complete letter, but he wrote back saying, "I have always maintained, excepting fools, men did not differ much in intellect, only in zeal and hard work." So you can see here that Darwin is holding his line. He's not giving away the idea that, yes, hereditary is everything. He's saying zeal and hard work are very important. That's what makes man or a woman. This was his response. But at the end, Darwin writes, "But it sets me thinking so much that I find it very hard work. That is wholly my fault and not of your beautifully clear, lucid style." So he basically let him go. He let this fake argument from Francis Galton go. He was very soft on him, I think, and this, in retrospect, perhaps was because he was a gentleman and should have been a lot harsher with his cousin. In response to this, Galton wrote, "Nowhere, etc., nowhere in the world whose appreciation in these matters can have the same weight as yours." So Galton was impressed, happy. He got a positive response from Charles Darwin, which was not the response Darwin perhaps should have given him. But in any case, Galton was encouraged, and he went on to write more books, and he went on to do more stupid things. One of the things that he came up with was Francis Galton's famous bell curve theory, which is the intelligence bell curve. And anybody that, you guys are IT professionals, so you know bell curves have low ends and high ends. And he used this to weigh intelligence in people by whatever rudimentary methods one can weigh intelligence in people. In those times, and even today, I think IQ tests are very dangerous and should be kept away from. But in any case, he came up with this theory that people of African descent were at least 2 grades lower than Europeans, and of course, whoever else was more different than Europeans was even worse, based on limited sampling. He, of course, he had reasonably good hold of mathematics and statistical methods. He set up fields of statistics on his own right. So he knew to a certain extent the mathematical underpinnings, but his sampling was really bad because he was himself sampling. This is what he used to do. Instead of coming up with real experimental data in terms of having an experiment designed and then done properly, he used to do it himself. And he used to say, wherever you don't have data, just start counting. One of his favorite things to do was to count. He used to walk around the UK, wherever he used to travel, with pinpricks that he would do every time he would see a woman, and he would classify them in these orders of beauty, attractive, indifferent, and repellent, and so on, and he would keep making notes of them, with the idea that if he could keep track of families, that beauty would travel in families, and so-called repellents will travel in families because it was all genetically endowed, which, as you know, is not true. Nonetheless, Francis Galton didn't himself, personally, besides planting these pseudoscience ideas do much more harm. And it could have been rejected, could have been thrown out of the consciousness of human mind, but it didn't happen. The American eugenics movement started, which was heavily influenced by Francis Galton. Galton was a very senior person in the UK scientific administration, and so it was inevitable that the Americans would pick up from him. The funding for a lot of the American eugenics movement came from Carnegie Institution, from Rockefeller Foundation, from the Kellogg Foundation, and so on. And so you know now that how important it is for Infosys to pick the right things to fund, because they can backfire on them and then it'll be labeled forever with that institution's name. In 1894, there was a so-called Immigration Restriction League set up. Look at the people who are in this league. It was actually set up by 3 students from Harvard University. There was the president of Harvard, there was the director of Wharton School that you know of, I'm sure, and the president of Stanford University. So it was this caliber of people who were intellectually behind the idea of immigration restriction, which was very heavy and predominant in America for a very long time, and perhaps may become again, we shall know in November. And in 1928, the extent of this idea had spread to many, many universities. So there were as many as 376 odd separate university courses that were actually taught along the lines of eugenics, positive eugenics. Keep black people out of our life, keep Indian people out of our, these are American Indians, but perhaps even Indians, because I think the first Indians who ever got to the US were in the 16th century. So there could have been some our Indians there as well. But in any case, keep all non-whites out. Some of the very famous scientists at that time were extremely racist. For example, Tesla here, who's been shown, who actively believed that given that there is survival of the fittest, that we must weed out the less desirable strains, that there should be no sense of pity when it comes to interfering with the laws of nature. That means do not help the infirm. It said you need a race to prevent the breeding of the unfit by sterilization. So it's going to a new level of pseudoscience from positive eugenics that, oh, well, white man shall not breed with anybody who's non-white. It's actually going to, let's not let the black man breed. Another famous racist of the time, who many of you might know, H.G. Wells, whose books we know of from in terms of science fiction, was also extremely brutal with his ideas. It is the sterilization of failures, he said, which is very important for the human stock. And you can see the intellectual forces at that time in UK and America were completely committed to eugenic ideas, many of them, not all, but many of them who were in notable positions, so as to basically transplant these ideas into legislation, which then happened. Another one who took on to these ideas very early was Charles Darwin, who was a chicken breeder, and because he naturally extrapolated from chickens to humans, thought, well, it was only reasonable that human beings should be treated just like chicken. So what was the idea behind these eugenic movements in America? Well, their ideals were that the families should be white, they should be healthy, they should have some perceptible IQ by methods measured completely dubiously. I'm not going to go into it, but we can discuss that later on. That they should have education, they should have an occupation. As you can see, this is basically ruling out all immigrants. They should have special talents and tastes, and they should specifically be associated with some church, because it's a Christian nation. And they should have some political views, which basically means that they should be participating in their so-called democracy. And so they even had fairs where they would bring children from different families and measure and weigh out children to see which children ended up looking better than the other ones by whatever criteria they decided. So there were awards for how well eugenics was being performed in societies. And these are the kind of posters that were around in the US at the time. Imbecility and genius are both inherited, wrong. And you can see on the left-hand side here, feeble-mindedness, we can't see very well, but we'll go to the next slide, this idea was brought on by Goddard, and in the right panel, which you can't see, is basically the genius lineage, where you can see very prominently Galton on the top and Erasmus Darwin. So they were protecting themselves and basically ruining all immigrants. Here's another convert to this idea who was extremely pernicious, Henry Goddard, 1866 to 1957. He was a very, very famous American psychologist and a eugenist. He wrote a book called Hereditary of Feeble-Mindedness. He was specifically sensitive, let's say, to idiots, morons, and what he called imbeciles. In case you think these three words more or less mean the same thing, they don't. You might have thought that you had a moronic boss, but I'm going to tell you definitions of morons which were actually legislated in the US at the time. And these were the definitions of morons, imbeciles, medium-grade imbeciles, and complete idiots. So be careful what you call your boss or think about it. If it doesn't fill in any of these lines, you can come up with a new word. In fact, the very word moron was actually coined by Goddard, which is interesting. And if you want to know more about what Goddard was up to in terms of how to implement in the immigration lines these ideas of segregating people into idiots, imbeciles, and morons, you should actually watch this YouTube video. I'm happy to share this link with you. And he was actually very, very concerned for some reason that morons should not reproduce. I'm not completely convinced with that, but anyway, somehow he had this idea that morons like to reproduce more, and he was trying to link morality to stupidity. And that's a dangerous thing to play. And so he said, for example, consider for a moment the sex emotion, supposed to be the most uncontrollable of all human instincts. I'm not so sure about that. Yes, it is notorious that the intelligent man controls even this. Absolutely not true. But anyway, this is what he believed. But he thought morons are actually lacking in all kinds of control. They cannot have any self-control. And so the only way to control them was via colonization. This is not colonization of imperialism. This is colonization of taking people and putting them into facilities where they can't get out of, essentially jailing them, and sterilization. And this is a photograph from those times of how Goddard used to go about doing these things. So negative eugenics dealt with sterilization laws. These laws were passed. Immigration restriction happened. Prohibition against racial intermarriages happened. So if you thought all of this was a joke, it wasn't, because all these ideas were legislated and acted upon in the US. Next time you're traveling in US, they tell you about your caste system in India. Please remind them about this lecture. They even went to the extent of ranking people in terms of races and their ability to murder. As you can see here, foreign white, old American, native white parentage, Negro, and Negroid. These are percentages of tendencies for these people to commit murders. This is quite incredible. They also disliked white people who were not of Catholic or Protestant origin, specifically Jews, and Italians who they thought were dysgenic, means they had bad genes. And you can see here Italians at the lowest rung of order here. This is getting a little political for Indian stuff, so let's not discuss this anymore. But you get the point. They were extremely, extremely prejudiced about people who weren't similar to themselves. Aside from sterilization and immigration protection, these ideas were pernicious because they spread to Europe. So they started in UK from Eugenics movement, moved to America, spread all over the states in America, in most of the states, and then came back to Europe, but in a very dangerous way. So here's a poster on the left-hand side of the eugenics, so-called eugenics building, happy family, all these people are practicing eugenics. On the right-hand side is a poster from Germany, and it says, "Wir stehen hin nicht allein," we do not stand alone. They were actually looking for people in the world who would support their stupid ideas about being prejudiced against Jewish people. They were looking for excuses, and they found the perfect excuses by countries like America actually actively passing laws about immigration and sterilization. And so here's Germany with this Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring Act, which was there initially to prevent all kinds of infirm Jews and foreigners out. And eventually, as you know, what it led to was the tragedy of Auschwitz, perhaps one of the biggest tragedies of 20th century, perpetrated in the name of eugenics. So this is the gate of Auschwitz, and men would turn to the left and women would go to the right, and as you know, none of them would appear back out of these gates. So these theories in themselves alone killed close to 6 million Jews, not to mention a scores of other people, and not to mention the fact that the harassment and torture of black and other races in America at the time is still unaccounted for. In Germany, as you know, there was this famous doctor Josef Mengele. Let's look at his curriculum vitae. He was studying medicine at Goethe University in Frankfurt, which, as you know, is one of the best universities there. And he had a double major, studied philosophy as well, eventually got doctorate degrees in anthropology and medicine. He was another firm believer that hereditary was the only thing that mattered. It had to rule over environment. That means Germans were the best, and blue eyes and tall blondes were the only thing that were hot. And so he, of course, proceeded to do things which were, in fact, far and beyond any of the eugenists had ever thought of. He started to do experiments on twins. As you know, twins, in many cases, have almost essentially identical genetic structure. And so these were great samples for him. On one given night, he actually killed himself 14 young twins, that is 28 children, because he was doing experiments with them of the kind that are listed here. He was clearly suffering from death drive. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this term of death drive. It was originally coined by Sigmund Freud when he got frustrated with other things in his life later on. And death drive actually explains a lot of things that were happening in the world at the time, and still explains a lot of things. Interestingly, Josef Mengele actually died a very happy and normal sort of death. He escaped Germany, was supported actively by many countries to survive and escape the Mossad agency which was tracking him. Eventually, he died of drowning in a swimming pool when he had a brain hemorrhage, so at the age of 79 or so, at the ripe age of 79. So he actually didn't get any divine retribution that he perhaps should have got. I'm going to cut the story here to move to the story that perhaps you were partly attracted to in terms of the microbiome, and try to link the two of them. So this is a cut a la 2001 Space Odyssey. I don't know if you guys have seen this film. You should see it, because in that Stanley Kubrick also makes a cut which is close to 2,000 years. So we are cutting out time from 1950s to 1990s, just because this presentation cannot go on forever. But on the left-hand side, I wish to show you that this was a time of transition. Molecular biology was waking up. It was beginning to explain everything that existed, essentially because of the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick. Crick, by the way, his grandfather was a close friend and collaborator of Charles Darwin, so that's not hereditary, but incidental. And in 1968, till 1968, you can see there was journals in libraries called Eugenics Quarterly. And then 1969, it suddenly changed. It became Social Biology. Still nonsense, but still, at least it didn't have the name of Eugenics Quarterly. So things started to change in 50s onwards in terms of human consciousness. And in a nutshell, molecular biology changed from having to explain a whole organism here, and we went all the way to the level of genes, which you know now are a great determining force in terms of explaining a lot of the life. Towards the end of 1990s, human enterprise came up with this idea that we will sequence the human genome, which I think was a brilliant idea. But as with many brilliant ideas, there's a payoff, and it, in part, has led to an existential crisis. And the reason is the following. It actually is completely consistent with all Darwinian ideas, but it's actually inconsistent with, again, with creationist theory. So if you're not a creationist, you'll be happy. If you're a creationist, you'll have existential crisis on this format. Because humans are just built up about approximately 25,000 genes. Not that many more than a lot of much smaller and less complex organisms, and significantly less, for example, than wheat or rice. So it's not the number of genes that determines what makes humans. In fact, it's not clear to us or to anybody else what makes humans. I think it's not clear in many cases to humans themselves that they are humans, as evident from their behavior. But aside from this idea that the human genome is all but 25,000 genes, there was also at the time this extremely negative view of microbes, that microbes were bad. Keep cleaning your hands all the time with soap and water, because that's how infection spreads. So there was this huge literature which was basically negative view of microbes. This has been completely overturned since the human genomic revolution, partly because we know now because of genetic tools that were developed in terms of sequencing, which has made it very easy to categorize life, that there are in fact lots more to humans than meets the eye. So the human microbiome is just a collection of all the non-human genetic material and all non-human living cells inside human beings. So if you are from a science persuasion, you would know that it is non-trivial to get your article published in Nature, and you can see several covers of Nature and Cell and many other magazines, including Science. They are talking about the microbiome. It went to the extent that even non-science magazines like The Economist, for which I have very high regard, said microbes maketh man. So there you go, it's not God maketh man. Now if The Economist has said it, it must be right. Microbes maketh man. So you can take it from me that the field of human microbiome, as evidenced by this literature, is an extremely, extremely important field. But let's look at it a little more closely. In fact, it turns out that the human body is mostly non-human. There are 10 times more non-human cells in a human body. More significantly, there are about 100 times more genetic material from the microbiome than there is from our genes. In other words, as I told you, human beings have about 25,000 genes, but the total genetic material, as in the total number of genes from the bacteria that live in us, is close to 2 to 3 million. So we have 100 times more genes that are part of us, which are non-human origin, than we previously knew. This, of course, will cause another existentialist crisis, which we will discuss shortly. But the fact remains that this is a huge new discovery. This is almost as significant a discovery as the fact that there was a hereditary basis to life, which was discovered by Mendel by doing experiments on peas. And so why is it significant? Because, well, it completely changes your own perspective of what you are and completely changes the perspective of, for example, being vegetarian. But anyway, so let's look at some of the experiments that have been done in this case. If you take obese mice usually don't get obese because they are pretty fit, they keep running around and doing things. They never sort of hang around and watch television for hours and hours. But if you can actually give them bad food, and which is called high-fat diet, which is what many humans take also, and they will become fat. So obese mice are like thus, one of the two. But if you were to take the microbiome from an obese mice and put it in a lean mice, the lean mice will become obese, which means that the characteristics that are driven by a bad environmental lifestyle, which is a bad food, have altered the microbiome, and this altered microbiome then alters the human physiology enough to make a lean to obese transition. Here's more evidence for this. These are the ideas of liberty, egalitarianism, and fraternity. I don't know if you guys know, but the French Constitution promotes them very strongly. They are very proud of their nation because it stands for liberty, egalitarianism, and fraternity, which comes in the form of banning burqas and so on. But anyway, we're not going to go into that. But if you compare the microbiomes of an average good-looking Italian, let's say, who's living in Florence, and just going by the stereotype, a pretty good athlete in Faso, Africa, their microbiomes are very different. These color spikes, these color pie charts actually are the list of bacterial species that constitute these two individuals. So they're significantly different. They're both human beings, they're both male, and they're very different in the context of their microbiome and therefore of the microbial DNA. If you look at the skin of people, the skin of people itself is very different. So you might say, well, people have dry skin or moist skin or extremely oily skin. Well, there is a basis for that perhaps, because if you were to take samples from these people's skins, these are the kinds of bacteria that exist in different skins: dry skin, sebaceous skin, and moist skin. They're significantly different from each other. So there is no one cream that should be applied by all people. That's the summary from this slide. More significantly, you should keep in mind that there might be, in fact, things about the microbiome that don't just affect you, but perhaps affect your child. And this is extremely important because in India, as I understand, the number of deliveries by cesarean is rising for one reason or the other, perhaps financial reasons, by the hospital. But in any case, it's been shown by evidence that if you were to take microbiota sample from a lady who was pregnant and who had either a vaginal delivery or a cesarean delivery, the microbiome of the infant is completely different. And in fact, the good microbiome is passed on to the baby only in the case of vaginal delivery. And that's because the seeding of the microbiome happens while the baby is traveling through the birth canal. And so this is extremely important, perhaps a case for reversal of banking on caesareans, which is based in many cases, I suppose, on astrology and vastu and so on. But in any case, I think you can reverse the decision by saying I've seen this talk and microbiome is more important than vastu. But now most clinicians understand that you need microbes. Children need microbes. If children don't have the good microbes, they will not have a healthy microbiome. And the reason is the following. If you look at the spectrum of microbiome of an infant, as it goes through transition from infancy to, say, the age of 3 or 4, these spikes here in red and blue and yellow are the different kinds of 2 dominating species of bacteria that exist in children. And they don't stabilize till the age of 4 or 5. So if the child was put on a trajectory of a poor microbiome because of caesarean delivery, the child will never recover from that trajectory unless supplanted, and we don't know how to supplant the good microbiome at the moment. So it's really important that children specifically, as in infants, are given the right microbiome. And one of the things is, of course, good diet, but another one for which there is lots of scientific evidence is avoiding giving antibiotics when they are very young, because antibiotics, as you know, will kill some good bugs and bad bugs, which is why some antibiotics have side effects. But the death of the bad bugs is all right, but the death of the good bugs is not okay, because you can't recover those good bugs in children. There is a very strong correlation also between microbiota in children from developed and developing countries. And that reason is because their diets are different, their lifestyles are different. This is, you can see where I'm going. You can actually use this as an excuse to start to differentiate people again. You can say, oh, well, I got the point, everybody has 25,000 genes, but look, their microbiota are different, so let me kill all these people. This is the kind of idea that can be nucleated by this new science. It's not going to happen, fortunately, not because of this lecture, but anyway, it's going to happen because people are far more aware that there is a molecular basis to life, and that there is no, the ideological basis of creationism doesn't explain anything, so it can be rejected now. So there can be, in fact, much more complicated scenarios with even within group variations in the microbiome. So you can have a cyclical case where you can have a cycle of malnutrition. So children who don't get enough to eat, their dietary intake of food is poor, nutrients is poor, they have poor immune responses, so they get infections more common. They get infections, they'll take antibiotics, or even if they don't take antibiotics, their microbiota will alter because these infection pathogens come at the cost of killing your good pathogens. That will change their gut permeability. They'll have leaky guts. That will again feed into malabsorption. So you can get caught into this vicious cycle. This study was partly done in Bangladesh with children who had malnutrition and undernutrition to show that the microbiome is such an important constituent of our lifestyle on a daily basis, especially for children. And finally, gut flora. Flora is a term for microbiome. And the brain are also connected in the sense that there are some studies to indicate that some of the neurotransmitters are in fact aided if you have certain populations of bugs in your gut. And there are what's called a gut-brain axis. This is very, very rudimentary in early days in this research to suggest that the moment you get stressed, some people, for example, lose their appetite. How is that suddenly you say, well, India lost the game to Pakistan in the last over or something, and people will either break the television or lose their appetite immediately. So how is it that the connection was made immediately from the mind to the gut? Why is the appetite being lost? So there is transmission via the spine cord between the gut and the brain, which has been not studied extensively, but there are indications that the microbiome may have a role to play in this. So in a nutshell, the microbiome is extremely critical for a lot of these diseases that I've mentioned here. Crohn's disease, I think we were having a discussion earlier with somebody on this, autoimmunity, allergy, metabolism, and so on. And it's actually very much at the center of good health now. This is a black box. Remember, we've already discussed there are 2 to 3 million genes, many of whose functions are not known, and they have more than 10 times as many cells as human cells. So this is effectively a different organ of the human body. In fact, in some cases, it can weigh up to 1 kilogram. So in fact, it could be considered a different organ, but spatially segregated and not in one place. So what have we learned so far? I'm going to end the talk shortly now. So I think the take-home message is the following. To my understanding, modern molecular biology in context of humans is the human genome plus the microbiome, plus the environment, and plus, because there may be other biological factors that we will discover in time, for example, metabolites. So the story goes on. This is all far away from the hereditary simple explanation that was promoted by creationists. If you look at the difference between Darwin and Galton, it is clear that they were extremely bright people who had access to a lot of wealth and ideas and bright intellectual environments. They were both in Cambridge. But as you know, now Darwin essentially came up with integrative ideas, whereas Galton came up with disintegrative ideas. They are cousins. So this is very telling. This is almost a story as if Mahatma Gandhi had a cousin who decided to become an ardent follower of Hitler. That didn't happen. But this is essentially the same story. So the similarities and differences between Darwin and Galton, I think, have to be highlighted. It's an extremely interesting duality, a bipolar disorder in that family that resulted in these two people with such different kind of scientific forces. I hope I've persuaded to you the score in this football game of theology to biology is 0-1. So that game is over. And I think the only game to play probably from here on is this game of humanism, where human values come first, but as long as they are actively supported by scientific evidence. And humanism is really a very nice term because it says here, and I Googled this, and as you can see, Google was advertising itself saying, so many million results were found in 0.38 seconds, but we know how Google does that. But anyway, humanism is a philosophical and ethical stance that emphasizes the value and agency of human beings individually or collectively, and prefers critical thinking and evidence over acceptance of dogma and superstition. I think this is a fantastic new word. For me, it has been a new word because it hasn't fully transformed me either, but I think it's a word to dwell on. And I'll end here by this very interesting Irish poet's quip, which says, "Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over and the tale hath had its effect." If you look at this of course predates the Galton inspired eugenistic movement. But if you look at this, it's actually very prescient, because falsehood flies and actually it's successful much over the truth for a very long time, as in the eugenics movement. But eventually, when the deception is over, as I hope the deception is over now, it is actually very, very late. We've already lost at least 6 million people in the Second World War, and probably scores of millions of people otherwise have suffered. And it's really very late. That falsehood that was injected into the scientific consciousness was so poisonous that it took a very long time and a very big toll. And there is no better example pictorially of this than Galton on one side, who I don't hold responsible personally, but I hope you will see the progression of his ideas eventually resulted in these massacres. And the lady on the right, I don't know how many of you know her. So the lady on the right is Dr. Yu, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine last year. She is a discoverer of artemisinin drug, who worked under Chairman Mao. She was told by Chairman Mao to discover drugs against malaria because they wanted to cure malaria, because their Chinese troops were not able to fight well enough because they were coming down with fever. And so she took it upon herself to discover this drug artemisinin, and it is estimated that since her discovery of this drug, artemisinin combination therapies alone have saved over 6 million lives. So you have here two people, one who has taken away 6 million lives and the other who has contributed 6 million lives, both using tools of science, but perhaps in ways where judgment says in retrospect that only one of the two of them was correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for this great, fantastic, enlightening lecture. Okay, now the floor is open for Q&A.
Sir, I come from a research institute we work with genetics, human disease genetics specifically. So my question is, as students of science, as researchers in science who are trying to bring about development in the field of science, we are constantly inhibited by the structures which we are governed by. And in India, for that matter, there is a very strong cultural root to this whole free-thinking ideas of evolution, if I may put it. My only question is, in terms of trying to make evolution and scientific critical thinking a more interesting or a more engaging concept with students and with professors. So how do we come about doing it? We already know that a certain scientist there is a movement running, the open secular movement, which is inviting people to open up, to share about what their beliefs are, their rational beliefs are. But I mean, in a constrictive or in a more restrictive environment, such as a developing country, how do we bring about something like this?
In a nutshell, I don't know the answer to this question. It's a very complex question, and but it's an extremely important question of how to ignite the idea of whether it's Darwinian ideas or there are people who support flat Earth. There are plenty of them. It's called Flat Earth Supporter Society. Just look them up on Google. So there are lots of loonies around. But the idea how to instill scientific methodology into consciousness is difficult, and in the Indian context, because of the complexity of India in terms of the huge diversity that we have here, which is wonderful, and also the fact that there is such a huge disparity between the economic classes, which essentially translates into intellectual classes in a way, unfortunately. So it's extremely difficult. What's interesting is that, Darwinian evolution is too slow, and it's not, in a way, in our lifetimes, it's not going to be perceptible. But what's important is the cultural evolution. Cultural evolution is much faster than Darwinian evolution. Cultural evolution actually works not by hereditary laws, but it works essentially by hereditary laws, because it's the transmission of acquired information. So if you're teaching your children, jump off the cliff, that information is not going to last for too long, because they will jump off and your generation will be over, right? So you always teach your kids, this is cultural evolution. You always teach your kids, or whoever you wish to teach, what are the best acquired characteristics which will make them so-called biologically successful. Of course, biological success, as you know, is only determined by two things. One, you survive, and one, you reproduce. But that's really low level of threshold for success. So I think cultural evolution is a very potent, strong force. And once it takes a foothold in the society, it has its own life. And the only example that I know, there are plenty of examples, but the only example that I know as in I have experienced it on almost a daily basis when I used to live in the UK, was that, in UK, they are, I think it is the lowest ever church-going population in their history. Most of their churches have been converted into nightclubs or discotheques, which is a good thing. But anyway, and so the idea is the population is becoming so rational and so rejecting of superstition or mythological underpinnings of existence, that they have adapted to this rational thinking, let's say. Having said that, the setback from Brexit. So the same population that chose to make Charles Darwin's idea successful also willingly chose Brexit. So human mind is extremely complicated. But that doesn't discount the fact that cultural revolution via evolution of culture is a very potent force. How to seed it in India so that it spreads, this is a very complicated thing, and I don't think I have the answers for this, and I don't think I should speculate on that. But if there were efforts to where one could contribute, I think one should make those efforts. I routinely go around in schools and colleges, whoever bothers to invite me, and give not this talk, but talks about Darwin and so on, and just to get at least a few people thinking about things. I haven't done a survey whether it's made any difference or not, but at least my conscience is clear, and I think that's what one can do.
Might I add a small afterthought that I mean, I don't know. This may just be a personal reflection of sorts, that any pedagogy, any idealism which forces itself on a large population, may it be scientific, may it be cultural, may it be religious, runs this risk of facing rebellism. So, as much as we would love to propagate the rationality of science, to get people to think, to question, to criticize, we should be careful to maintain a balance of not enforcing that so much. Like you said, like you rightfully used the Britain's UK's example, where there is a complete cultural disconnect. But I find a significance for both, a balance as such, between what we call morality through culture to what we call facts through science. And thank you, because you shared a lot of interesting ideas, which I would have really loved to hear in our institute.
Hi, I have a question here. It's more of a curiosity. You have talked about the Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So it's more like, is it something which happened due to malnutrition and all? And was it transferred to their genetic structure as well, or
Crohn's disease has some loose correlation with some genotypes. So you can get genetic testing done for Crohn's disease. There are a few. This is very complicated field because.
But does the Crohn's disease, does it add up to your genetics? Does it get passed on to?
Yes. Crohn's disease is and related syndromes will get. They're genetically linked. They will get passed on, but not necessarily in the format of Crohn's disease. So, but they would be in the form of some inflammatory disease, allergic responses. So, for example, incidentally, it's a good question. My friend suffers from Crohn's disease, and his 3 children suffer from all kinds of severe allergies. They're hypersensitive, but they don't have Crohn's so far. So there is the polygenic structure that determines Crohn's disease, in addition to the environmental factors, is triggered in the children in a different format, in a different syndrome. But that problem is there of hyperreactivity, inflammatory hyperreactivity.
Okay, so
yes, it's
those
genetic.
diseases kind of get added to the genes every time, or they get separated also during the reproduction time.
So we don't know the genetic basis for Crohn's disease necessarily. There are some loose associations. So if you take all the people in this room, despite the fact that this is evident that we are all human beings, but our genetic structures are very different from each other, slightly, but evidently in millions of places, which are called SNPs. This each base in our genomes is different in many places. In some places, it's common. So there is some loose association between SNPs and some forms of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis or IBD, some of these inflammatory disorders. Genetic basis is not completely explained. But if it was the case, let us say in sickle cell anemia, which is a monogenic disease, if it was the case that you clearly knew the gene that was responsible for it, then its segregation could be, in subsequent population, could be predicted based on Mendelian laws, if it was monogenic, which is what he did with the peas, Mendel.
Right.
But if it's polygenic, and by the way, most diseases and traits are polygenic, and more complicated because environmental plays a role, then it becomes very difficult to predict what's going to happen in subsequent generations at the moment.
Okay, and can a gene be separated? Suppose you're married, you are going to have a kid, so you know which gene, suppose HLA-B27 usually causes the ankylosing spondylitis or something similar in Crohn's disease. So if you were to suppose, you are going to conceive and all, so can you separate that genes from the child, during?
I think what you're sort of loosely alluding to is genetic editing, as in correcting errors in the fused embryo. And I think CRISPR-Cas, as you know, is one of these new technologies that's coming on to do these editing, but it's banned in many countries because you can easily, on one excuse, try to get rid of Crohn's, but then try to propagate other ideas. But China is going ahead with it anyway. But so it may be possible in the future that you can specifically edit out faulty. So if you could locate Crohn's disease to a particular SNP or sets of SNPs, you could individually, in principle, go and correct them so that the offspring will not have those. Because once it's corrected in the DNA, it necessarily will go in the correct form. That is clear. If it was, and maybe there is a case for that.
My question is, on the one hand, when we read about the human genome and about genetics in popular literature, it is almost as if the genes have a mind of their own, and the way genes switch on and switch off and how they function is almost as if they're doing it on their own. And similarly, when you read about subatomic particles and how quantum mechanics works, there also it looks like a lot of the subatomic particles seem to have a mind of their own and how they behave. And there are a lot of experiments how electron seems to have gone back in time and changed its behavior if they change the conditions of the experiment midway and things like that. And then on the third side, we have a lot of our ancient literature about how we are all one with the universe and everything is just energy, and it's not really matter. And so these are all three very diverse fields, but in some sense everything kind of in some sense seems correlated. So I just wanted to hear your views on that.
One has to be careful with correlations. It's a common fallacy in science that if things are correlated, that either they are causal or that they are meaningful. I have done a correlation between the raise in my salary over time, which is insignificant, to the distance Halley's comet is now from Earth. And I can tell you the R squared value is 0.95, so it correlates really well. I don't know what Halley's comet is doing to people who run my institute, that they are dampening my salary raise, but so correlations are tricky things. You can correlate completely irrelevant events, unconnected events, over time, and they shall give you a correlation. So that's not causal, and that's not meaningful unless the experiment has been done correctly. So I'm afraid I can't correlate. I think the electron behavior you're talking about is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is you can't locate the time and speed of a subatomic particle, which has been proven over and over again. That Heisenberg's uncertainty principle exists. But in terms of the determinism that has been advocated to genes, that's partly fault of modern media, because modern media, and in many cases modern governments, another good example again would be the US government, are very keen to come up with very small trivial solutions to problems which their society faces. So for example, in the 80s, the Americans tried to look for a gene for homosexuality, and there was a paper saying, we discovered the gene for homosexuality. It was not the case. There was papers indicating that they had discovered the gene for criminality, which was again not the case. A lot of these cultural issues are actually polygenic, and add to them the environmental vagaries, and it's very difficult to have any correlation with reality. So the determinism that is attributed to genes in many cases, except for cases which this gentleman asked me, for example, where clearly a bad or mutant gene drives disease. Sickle cell anemia is one example, and there are Huntington's disease and many other examples, where there is a very tight correlation. Except for that, which is in the scientific realm, in the realm of common man's idea of genes, I think this determinism idea is bad, because there is a tendency that one thing will explain everything, and it doesn't. Especially in biology, it doesn't. We know in subatomic physics, it doesn't, because that's why boson's particle made such a big fuss, and Higgs discoveries have made big fuss, and there'll be many such discoveries in future, I'm sure. So the human tendency to look for one solution, as in determinism, is more at fault than the science behind it, is my point.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm not a scientist, but I'm a historian, and I think a lot of your talk was on the history of science, really. So I just wanted to ask a question. In a couple of the, you stressed very well the intellectual context behind how eugenics became such a mainstream idea. There's also a social and economic context to that, and a lot of the slides that you alluded to about productivity, and of course what was written over Auschwitz was Arbeit macht frei. And so eugenic ideas were important for capitalism in the early part of the 20th century to provide a very cheap pool of labor. And so I just want to ask a question about how science is funded institutionally today, and whether those kind of dangers are still present. I'd just like to hear your opinion.
Whether
dangers in terms of there was an interest in the early 20th century for capitalism to acquire cheap labor.
Yeah.
Gave eugenic ideas huge gravitas.
Yes.
And I wondered what you think about those kind of nexuses today.
I'll need lots of time to think about this. I haven't thought about this. I fully take your point that the eugenics movement co-opted the economic need of the hour, especially in British colonies, to exploit the natives, as in me, my parents and their parents and so on, to promote the British economy. As you know, before the British came, India's GDP was 24% of the world's GDP, and then when they left, it was 0. And eugenics ideas may have contributed in terms of it was acceptable for the economic state to exploit natives because they were inferior anyway. If that subconsciously weighed on their minds and actually resolved their existential crisis in terms of they were doing a bad thing, perhaps it contributed. I'm sure it contributed. I mean, the British didn't teach, contrary to the idea that the British think, they didn't sort of teach Indians anything that was not in their interest to eventually exploit us, including the education system and setting up trains and so on and so forth. So it was all driven by the idea of exploitation and the fact that we were considered inferior. Even some Indians think they're inferior to British, so that can't be held very much. But anyway, but I have not thought about modern science funding, whether that's pushing some unsaid agenda. I haven't thought about that, I'm sorry.